Wow, 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 wow. Okay, so coming right off of Sonic and the Secret Rings, Sonic and the Black Knight is quite a dramatic improvement. This game has basically taken almost all of my major issues with Secret Rings and addressed them in one way or another. The controls are better, Sonic's movement is better, the mechanics are better, the game design is better, the level design is better. This really is exactly what you kind of want to see out of a sequel, just taking the original game, fixing its flaws, and improving it as much as you can. Which is kind of weird, because I think when these games first came out, Secret Rings was pretty well received, and Black Knight was, like, horribly panned, because Black Knight is, like, undoubtedly much, much better than Secret Rings, if you ask me. I'm gonna assume that just gets chalked up to the fact that Secret Rings was a very early Wii game, and so people were kind of excited about motion controls or whatever. But by the time Black Knight was out, there were a lot of better games on Wii, and so by comparison, it wasn't as good. But comparing the two games together, Black Knight is definitely a major improvement. So, getting right into things, Sonic and the Black Knight is very, very much the same kind of game as Secret Rings was. It's clearly built right off of the same engine and tools, and a lot of the design elements of the game are pretty much the same. Like, you're still kind of running forward on essentially a line on an automatic preset scripted path, and a lot of the gameplay physics and controls and mechanics are very, very similar to Secret Rings. But there have also been a lot of changes and improvements made. For example, the motion controls have been totally reworked in Black Knight. Now, instead of using the Wii Remote sideways and you use motion controls to control Sonic, now the game is played with a Wii Remote and nunchuck, which means you get to use a good old-fashioned analog stick to control Sonic's movement. And that is just already a massive improvement right there. The controls in the game are much better. Not just like the inputs to use the controls, but also just the way Sonic moves, the way he behaves. It's all a lot more polished. It still can be a little bit rough around the edges for sure, but definitely a lot better than Secret Rings was. I didn't have nearly as many weird instances of Sonic wigging out and reacting some weird way to collision, or the physics bugging out in some bizarre way. Black Knight was a lot more stable and a lot more manageable. And then on top of that, the mechanics have been reworked quite a bit to make things a lot better, biggest one being jumping. They decided to get rid of that stupid charge jumping crap, and now you jump like a real video game, where you just press the button and Sonic jumps immediately, and depending on how long you hold it, you'll either do a short hop or a high jump. There you go, that's much better. Instantly, that makes the controls feel so much better in this game. Honestly, I have no idea what they were thinking with that charge jump stuff in Secret Rings, but this is a lot better. Now you can actually platform, like, at a good pace, where you don't have to stop every single time you want to make a jump. You can just run forward and do stuff, and it's just so much better feeling. Along with that, pretty much all the other mechanics from Secret Rings are here, fairly unchanged. A lot of the game feel is very, very similar in Sonic and the Black Knight, but just cleaned up a little bit from Secret Rings. For example, one thing that they improved on is moving backwards. They've now added this big backflip that you can do that will launch you backwards a good amount of speed, so you don't have to just slowly walk backwards the whole time. It's still not great that you can't just turn around, but this is definitely an improvement and makes going backwards much less of a pain in the ass. The only thing about Black Knight's controls compared to Secret Rings that I don't like as much is that you still have the jump cancel thing you can do, where you just immediately launch downward, but you can only do that after an air dash now because it's done with the same input, so it's kind of like a 1, 2, 3. You press it once to jump, a second time to air dash, and then a third time to stomp downward, which works and it's functional. It's just I want to be able to just have access to that jump cancel whenever I want, instead of having to dash forward a small distance before I'm able to do it. I don't really know why they didn't make that a separate input, because there are a couple of buttons in the Wii Remote Nunchuck configuration that don't do anything, so you could have easily fit that on something, but they just didn't. But that's a pretty minor gripe in comparison to all the control issues that Secret Rings had. That's like my only huge problem with how this works, so we're pretty much fine from there. Of course, this is Sonic and the Black Knight, and so we do have some other new mechanics to talk about with all of the sword stuff added to the game. Now you can swing the Wii Remote, and that will make Sonic slash his sword. And it's not like Skyward Sword type swinging, it's just waggle detection. It's basically just a button input. If the game detects that you swing the Wii Remote in any way, then it will just make Sonic do the sword swing action, There's no, like, manual control of the sword in any way in this game, which I'm totally fine with, because that sort of combat really would not gel with, like, a fast-paced platformer where you're, like, moving forward all the time to, like, stop and engage in combat with enemies that much. You just use the sword to slash through them as you run forward. Like, they're gonna work as obstacles trying to get in your way and slow you down, and you cut through them while still rushing forward. That works pretty well for Sonic, I would say, at least conceptually. And you do have to use the sword for dealing with all the enemies in the game, because they don't actually take any damage from the homing attack in this game. The homing attack is just used as a way to, like, launch yourself at an enemy and set yourself up for future sword attacks, but the only way to deal damage to enemies is to use sword swings. Which, you know, obviously that makes sense. It's a whole game about using your sword, so they want to force you to use it, and so, okay, whatever, homing attacking and jumping into enemies and stuff, that doesn't work in this game. That's not really much of a problem, if you ask me. Though, one kind of annoying thing about the game is that if you try to run past enemies and you get a little bit too close to them, then they're gonna, like, bonk you back and kill all of your speed, and that's to prevent you from just running past them. I understand that. It's so you actually engage with them and kill them with your sword. The problem I have with this mechanic is that a lot of the sword attacks that Sonic does have him, like, automatically lunge forward toward enemies, and if you're a bit too close when you try to do one of these attacks, then Sonic will launch himself at the enemy before he actually completes the sword swing, and so he'll get so close to the enemy that they'll bonk him back and cancel his attack animation. That's pretty clunky. That's like the major issue that this game has in terms of, like, its feel. They really should have made it so that when you're doing these sword attacks, you're immune to the enemies pushing you back. That would totally fix the problem, but unfortunately, it is something that you run into, and it is pretty clunky feeling. But it's not that bad. You can generally deal with it or work around this issue for the most part, because there are a fair amount of different ways you can attack with the sword that work in different ways and have different properties. The most prominent way that you're going to be using the sword is just running forward and slashing, where Sonic will do like a little running slash, keeping his speed up. This is good for taking out like 1 or 2 enemies that are in your way, but if you have to deal with a larger number of enemies, then this is where that kind of clunky hitting the enemy repeatedly runs into. But that is where other ways you can use the sword come into play, because you actually do have like a combo series of attacks you can do from standing still, where you do a couple of hits all in sequence, and this is good for dealing with like enemies that are all up in your face or bigger enemies that you can't run past. It's fairly useful, but unfortunately it's pretty slow and clunky to do because you have to come to a complete stop in order to trigger these attacks, and so there's a lot of times where you're going to be trying to do these and not do them, or you're going to accidentally do them when you don't want to because an enemy bonks you and that makes you stop when you do want to keep on moving. It can be pretty finicky to get Sonic to do the right sword attacks that you want him to do at the right time. It takes a bit of practice, but eventually you can get the hang of it and generally make him do what you want him to do. Another good option you have to avoid these kinds of problems is Sonic's jumping attack, where he rolls up, and this is a good way to just keep your momentum moving and just keep going and slashing through whatever's in your way. This is a really good way to completely avoid bonking into enemies and having any kinds of animation issues and stuff. This is by far your most reliable attack. And then actually this game also does have like kind of motion input based attacks. Not really like doing motions like a fighting game, but if you tap forward on the left stick at the same time that you attack, then Sonic will do like this lunging thrust that gives you a little bit of extra distance, and if you press back and attack, then Sonic will do like this rising uppercut that will launch him into the air. And you might think that these things aren't that useful, but actually they do have a fair amount of practical application. For like extending your base combo, you can use the thrust, and the backswing attack has a very good application that I'll talk about in a little bit. But for now, another mechanic you have with the sword is, of course, blocking, so you can absorb enemy attacks. And your block does have a, like, limited shield duration on it. You can't just hold it there and be completely invincible. If you hold it for too long, then eventually your block will drop and the enemies will be able to hit you again. So you gotta kind of be a little bit careful and make sure you manage your block well. I mean, you really never block when you're playing through, like, the levels ever. You only do it occasionally in certain specific situations. The primary use for blocking is when you're fighting the boss fights, which are, like, sword fights against other Sonic characters, but other than that, you basically never use it. And by the way, you can also block at the exact moment when an attack is about to hit you, and that'll give you a parry, but it's pretty generous. The parry timing on this is pretty easy to do, and successfully parrying enemy attacks will fill up the soul gauge returning from Sonic and the Secret Rings, which can now be used for what's called Soul Surge in this game, which is basically the same thing as Speed Break from Sonic and the Secret Rings. Time break is gone, that's no longer a mechanic, but you can still rush forward super fast with minimal control. But now here in Black Knight, they've also added an additional function to the Soul Surge, which is when you run into an enemy while doing it, then Sonic will automatically target onto them, and you can attack to get him to rush at the enemy and automatically attack them, basically killing them instantly or doing a heavy amount of damage to larger enemies. And there's also a kind of timing thing to this, where if you hit them right as the reticle lights up white, then you will hit them and you'll get refunded a big chunk of Soul Surge. In fact, if you time this correctly, you can actually profit in Soul Gauge from this, allowing you to keep doing this perpetually as long as you have enemies to build off of. And again, the timing on this is incredibly easy, so it's pretty much free that you're just going to get infinite Soul Gauge as soon as you can start doing it, which is kind of neat. You can just blast forward, cut through a bunch of enemies, blast forward, cut through a bunch of enemies. It's kind of cool. But to be honest, the Soul Surge is something I really don't like to use for actually fighting enemies because it takes so long doing this animation, waiting for the timing, slashing at them. It's much faster to just fight the enemies normally, so that's often what I opt to do. I'll use the Soul Surge for the speed boost, but once I run into enemies, I'll stop doing it and then fight them normally. Though I do sometimes use it in certain situations for like larger enemies. It's generally the fastest way to deal with them, and sometimes certain awkward situations where enemies are all over the place kind of getting in your grill, the Soul Surge can be a good, easy way to deal with them so you can keep moving forward. And that's pretty much it for the bulk of the mechanics in Sonic and the Black Knight, and as I said, I think this game is a dramatic step up from Sonic and the Secret Rings. It's a lot more fun to play, the controls are a lot better, the mechanics are more well-designed and well-implemented here, though I don't want to make it sound like it's, like, incredible. Like, it's still a fairly okay-ish game for the most part, but definitely a big step up from the previous game. However, I have yet to talk about my favorite mechanic in the game, another type of sword attack you can do that is really fun. It's something kind of akin to the Lightspeed Attack from the Sonic Adventure games, where you can automatically launch yourself from enemy to enemy super quickly, plowing through them like it's nothing. This move is triggered in 3 different ways as far as I know. The first way you can trigger it is by using Sonic's Rising Uppercut attack. If you hit an enemy with that and Sonic has things to lock onto, then if you attack again while you're in the air above an enemy, then he will automatically fly through the enemies in front of him, cutting them all down. Another way you can trigger this is by homing attacking into an enemy, and similarly, when you're like in the air above them, then you can also slash and that will trigger the same effect. And just through using these 2 methods alone, this move is really fun, and it totally fixes a lot of the issues with the combat in the game, although it kind of ends up irrelevantizing combat for the most part, because now you don't really have to pick and choose what's the right attack option to use most of the time, because you just do this and you'll just fly past an entire group of enemies, killing them all super easily. But at the same time, it's also the most fun and efficient way to take out enemies, and it doesn't always work all the time. Certain enemy types are either immune to this, or they're really hard to make it to work because their hitboxes, you're just going to fly right into them if you try to do it. So it's not necessarily an end-all be-all answer to things, and you know, if there's just 1 or 2 enemies, then it's usually faster to just cut them down normally, so it's kind of just an extra piece to the puzzle. It's like the most prominent way that you attack enemies a lot of the time, but it's not so overbearing that it completely irrelevantizes the other ways you attack. However, towards the end of my time with Sonic and the Black Knight, I learned something about this Lightspeed Attack move, which is that you can actually trigger it during a homing attack. You can cancel a homing attack with a sword slash, and that will automatically transition it to the attack. And so now the kind of setup that you have to do, either homing attacking into an enemy or the rising slash that makes this move take a while, kind of goes away, and now you can just plow through entire hordes of enemies in a second, and this basically removes almost all of the combat from the game. Like I said, certain enemies it still won't work against, and certain enemies you will get hit if you try to do it against, but the vast majority of the game can now be boiled down into just doing this move constantly and just slashing through everything. And the thing about Sonic and the Black Knight is that it has a lot less emphasis on platforming compared to a typical Sonic game or even Secret Rings. There still is a good amount of platforming, but a large amount of the gameplay here is just running forward and encountering enemies that you're supposed to deal with. And so all of these encounters get boiled down to enemies appear and then they die basically as soon as they enter your range, and so combat kind of just vanishes through the game as you cut everything down. However, this is one rare instance where I'm actually going to drop my interest in game design and interesting choices that I have to make as the player and challenge and all that kind of stuff, And actually, I'm just gonna say that this is cool. This is fun. This is just really satisfying and enjoyable to launch Sonic forward and plow through entire groups of enemies super quickly. Like, yeah, it's really repetitive and basic and simple, and it basically reduces all of the combat mechanics in the game to nothing. But god, it's just so much fun to do. I could do this move over and over and over again, and it's just as fun every single time. Just look at this gameplay. Look at how quickly I'm flying through these levels and cutting everything down. Like, it's so cool. Even someone like me, from time to time, I can drop my critical interest in game design and just go, bro, this is just fucking fun. Like, no joke, this is my favorite part of Sonic and the Black Knight, just doing this move and plowing through hordes of enemies. The general gameplay of the game, I think, is relatively enjoyable for the most part, but this one single mechanic kind of elevates the entire game for me from okay with some problems to something that I can happily put up with the problems because goddammit, this is just so cool. That said, this isn't the only mechanic I like about the game. The general systems here, I think, are fairly decent for the most part. Like, yeah, you can just get through this game just holding forward and waggling for the most part. That actually will work in a lot of instances, but you're going to end up taking a lot of hits that way and going very slow and yada yada. So if you actually want to get a little bit more efficient and play well, you do actually need to think about what you're doing, when you want to do it, how you want to do it, and all that. And, you know, the platforming is okay in this game. Nothing amazing, but it's decent. Definitely a lot better than the Secret Rings platforming, I would say. When you're actually trying to play the game well, then there's enough here to keep you engaged, I would think. And then this kind of Lightspeed Attack move is the icing on top that makes the game that much more fun. So yeah, like I said, quite a big improvement over Sonic and the Secret Rings. I think for the most part, generally, the gameplay and mechanics here and the abilities you have are pretty enjoyable, as opposed to Secret Rings, where most of it was not very good, and a couple of the elements of the gameplay I did like. Here it's kind of the inverse, where I like most of what's going on here. There's just a couple of problems here and there that bog it down a little bit, but for the most part, I would say the package comes together. It is, again, still fairly janky, similar to Sonic and the Secret Rings. Not as much, but it still definitely has some problems that you run into fairly regularly. And similar to many other 3D Sonic games, if you never actually, like, figure out how to play the game, then it can just seem like a clusterfuck of shit happening with no rhyme or reason to it. Which I think is probably what's most responsible for the game's negative reception, because the game, you can just get through it by waggling for the most part, and so a lot of people are never really going to learn what you can do in this game and the parts of it that actually make it pretty fun. But if you actually take the time to stop flailing the Wii Remote wildly and you actually learn how to play, it's like, okay, this game can actually be decently fun. I still wouldn't say it's an amazing game or a great game by any means, but I can't deny that while playing Sonic and the Black Knight, I generally had a good time throughout my entire playthrough. As far as level design is concerned, like I said before, I think that the game is generally a lot better designed than Sonic and the Secret Rings. I think the platforming here is a lot better designed, and while there is a lot of just flat ground with just enemies for you to fight, that actually works pretty well because of how satisfying it is to cut them down quickly and keep running forward. Of course, most of the time you can just run past or jump over the enemies if you want, which I guess is not exactly great game design, but since it's so satisfying to fight the enemies most of the time, I usually prefer to fight them rather than go around them. Plus, once you start learning more of the advanced stuff, then I actually think it's faster to use the enemies to propel yourself through the level quickly than it is to just slowly jump over them. And there are a couple of other ways that the game rewards you for killing enemies that I'll talk about later, so I think it's overall pretty fine. Structurally, the game is pretty similar to Sonic and the Secret Rings, but they have improved the pacing of the game quite substantially. First of all, they completely got rid of that horrible tutorial from the beginning of the game that Secret Rings had. Now it's just a simple tutorial level that you play through and it gives you all the basics of the game, no problem. Thank you very much for that. But for the greater game as a whole, Black Knight has a bit more content than Secret Rings did. That game only had 7 levels in it, where Black Knight, I think, has 11. And also, the mission-based structure of Secret Rings is back here in Black Knight. However, they have reworked and made it much less tedious. First of all, when you're playing through the story mode of the game, you don't really get thrown a lot of random pointless side missions very often. Most of the time, you only have one new mission available at a time, and that's the story mission you have to do. There's only a couple of instances where they throw at you an optional side mission that you can choose to do if you feel like it, or you can ignore. Which means that it is much easier to identify what a main mission is, because most of the time it's the only mission available, or it's the one that obviously is related to the story context of where you are in the game at that point. They don't just have you do random missions for no reason until the next cutscene plays in Black Knight. Things are a lot more logical and easier to figure out here, so I had no issue figuring out what I was supposed to do next or how to progress in the story. And the game also throws a lot less of the missions at you just in general while playing through the game. The vast majority of the main mission levels are just the straight get to the end of the level type affair, with only a handful of like kill this number of enemies or do this number of things or whatever kind of missions. Only a couple here and there, so the game is much less repetitive and much less relying on like weird, shitty gameplay where you're doing some bizarre objective. This also means that you're playing the same level over and over significantly less in Black Knight than you are in Secret Rings, so the pacing of the game is also very much improved. A lot more of your time is going to be spent in new levels doing new things, which is very nice. Essentially, they have cut down on the padding from Sonic and the Secret Rings substantially. There's very little padding here in Sonic and the Black Knight at all, actually, which is great for the game pacing, but it also kind of creates a little bit of an issue in the game length, because Sonic and the Black Knight is a short fucking game. Not counting cutscenes, I beat this game in just an hour and a half. It is that short. Though, personally, I don't really have a problem with short games at all, as long as the game is fun. I would rather have a very tight and enjoyable hour and a half long game than I would a very padded out or stretched out 6-hour game. So I'm not really going to hold the length of Sonic and the Black Knight against it very much. I mean, the original Sonic games are like less than an hour long in most cases, and I got no problem there. I guess one part of the game that's not particularly improved is the boss fights. The boss fights in this game, most of them are sword fights against other Sonic characters, where it's kind of like a duel thing, which is of course what you would want to do with a King Arthur themed game with swords and all that. But similar to most rival fights in many Sonic games, these are just awful. They're clusterfucks. Either you just get completely annihilated by the AI and you don't really understand why or what you did wrong, or you kind of just flail at them for a bit and then they die in like 10 seconds, and you also don't really know what you did right, and you're just kind of like, okay, I guess I won. So that's unfortunate, because, you know, with a game like this, you would want the sword fights to be a big, cool highlight, and they are neat from, like, a spectacle perspective. They got cool music playing, and you're dueling with other Sonic characters, and it's super cool. But the actual gameplay is just like, is basically like playing a fighting game and just mashing buttons against your opponent until somebody wins. And I say that as someone that is trying to learn these fights and actually play them well and with intention, but at a certain point it kind of just turned into figuring out how I can abuse the AI to quickly and easily kill them with barely actually engaging in the fight with them. So yeah, not very good. And then as far as more traditional boss fights go, the game has very, very few of them, and they're generally pretty easy and over in a blink of an eye, so nothing really new for Sonic games. And it does have your classic Supersonic Final Boss minigame, although this one, I do have a special note to make about it, which is that it is a complete joke. It is so easy and so brief. This boss goes down in like 30 seconds or something like that. It is ridiculous. And that pretty much makes up the core gameplay of just playing through Sonic and the Black Knight, but there are a couple of extra things to talk about. For one, this game has a number of systems in it that I don't even understand why they were implemented into the game. For the most part, a lot of these things are extremely superfluous. Like, first of all, you can play as other characters. You can play as Shadow, Knuckles, and Blaze in this game, and they all have different movesets and different abilities from Sonic. Which is cool, but you only unlock them when you're like 2/3 of the way through the game. And the thing is, none of them are actually as good as Sonic. For the most part, they play generally the same, but just inferior in one way or another. Shadow's air attacks are way too slow, and Knuckles and Blaze don't have access to a homing attack, and none of these characters can do the Lightspeed Attack move that Sonic has, so playing as any of them is kind of just like playing as an inferior version of playing as Sonic. So I really never had any motivation to play as any of these characters beyond the first time I tried them just to see what their moves were, where I went, oh, it's like Sonic, but worse. Okay, back to playing Sonic. I mean, you know, I guess this is just a case of the design not really working out. It would be cool to play as other characters, it's just not really that great here. But again, even then, why do you unlock these characters when you're almost done with the game? Remember, this game's only an hour and a half long, so the last third of the game is only like a half hour. There's only like 3 or 4 levels you get to play as these characters in before you beat the game. It's so strange. But then, even weirder than that, these characters that you barely get to play and that you're never really going to play because they're just worse than Sonic, they have a whole weapon crafting system as well, where every time you complete a level, then you get a bunch of objects that you can spend identification points to ID these items, and then you get them added to your inventory, and you can use these items to craft weapons that the other characters can use. Sonic can't use any of these weapons. He's stuck with his default sword the entire time, so these are only for the additional 3 playable characters that you only unlock when you're almost done with the game that you're never going to actually play as for the most part. It's just so weird. Why did they even bother to implement this? Like, it's such a huge and involved system. There are so many items that you can collect and so many weapons you can craft for these other characters that the game barely ever gives you any time to even use, and the weapons themselves do very, very little. They modify your stats a little bit here and there, but that ultimately has very little impact on the gameplay, and so it's just like, why did they put in the work to make this whole system and all these different weapons? I just don't understand it. And then, like, for other systems that barely impact the game, you also have, as other items you can identify, equipable items, where you can have 2 items equipped that give your characters some sort of passive benefits, like extra XP for doing this or that, or extra points for killing enemies in combos, or even ones that, like, change the music or whatever. You know, typical stuff, increase your defense and blah blah blah, but again, these impact the game so incredibly little, and there are so many of these things. You can only equip 2 of them, so you play through the game getting all these stuff, and then you get 2 of them that are kind of okay, you equip those, and then you stop paying attention to this system entirely. And again, these things do so little that it's like, what was even the point of creating this system? I don't get it. And then additionally, the game does have a leveling up system, kind of similar to what Secret Rings did, but it works very differently. In Secret Rings, you had like the whole skill system where you can pick and choose and equip different skills in order to customize Sonic to be how you wanted. Here in Black Knight, they have taken that away, and instead they have given you 3 styles that you can use that are kind of tuned toward one thing or the other. You have a speed-based style, a combat-based style, and kind of an all-rounder in-between style. And as you play through the game with this style equipped, when you complete levels and kill enemies and stuff, you get XP that will level up that style, and the more you level it up, then the more things you're going to unlock for it. Extra speed buffs, extra defense, extra damage. Basically, the abilities that you unlocked and equipped in Sonic and the Secret Rings have been turned into the things you unlock as you level up these different styles, and they've been assigned to one style or the other. But again, this isn't really that significant. I mean, it's definitely the biggest of these superfluous systems out of any of them, but still, it's not that huge of a deal, because unlike Sonic and the Secret Rings, this game, your base starting stats are plenty good and adequate to get through the game no problem. It's not like in that game where leveling up gave you the vast majority of the things that made the game playable and fun. Here, at the base starting level, you could play through the entire game with just the starting stats and it would be totally fine. These extra upgrades and stuff really don't contribute very much. Like, they have some nice benefits to them, but it's not really needed at all. And the 3 different styles are very negligibly different from each other for the most part, because the game's design is not really that nuanced where it's actually gonna matter that much. And also, again, you only have 1 style at the beginning of the game, and you don't unlock the other 2 until you're almost done with the game. So this whole different style system barely even comes into play. Why did they design all of these weird things into the game that they barely take any advantage of? It's so strange to me. You could literally just not have any of these, and it wouldn't really harm the game almost at all. I guess it's not really necessarily a problem to have all these things in the game, but I just look at them and I'm puzzled by their design, their existence, and their implementation. Perhaps during the development of the game, they were planning these mechanics to be much more prominent and very different in how they ended up being in the final game, but things just didn't really work out. I'm not really sure. Anyway, as far as the rest of the game goes, once you've beaten the main campaign, you have all the extra missions to do on all the levels, because there actually are a good number of missions available on every level. They just don't give you a lot of access to them early on while playing through the campaign. You generally unlock side missions by completing more side missions, and so what might seem like there's only like 2 or 3 missions to do on a level, if you keep on playing and keep doing side missions, then you'll unlock more and more and more until there's actually a good amount of them. And the missions here are generally much better designed and much more fun than the ones that were in Sonic and the Secret Rings, and also, there's not nearly as many missions per level, and they don't have every single type of mission in every single level, so there's a lot more variety in what you do in Sonic and the Black Knight, and the game has you bouncing around between levels a lot more, so things don't get nearly as repetitive. So doing the side missions, again, it's not nearly as fun as just playing the base levels where you just go through, but they're definitely a lot more fun than they were in Secret Rings. They're not really that much of a problem. So, you know, it's okay for the most part. But then finally, of course, we do have the ranking system in the game, which is a little bit different than the ranking system in other Sonic games, because in this game, it's done on like a star rating system, so the highest rank is to get a 5-star completion of a level, and the ranking system in this game does not fuck around at all. This is probably the strictest ranking system that has ever been in a Sonic game. You have to play nearly perfectly in order to get 5 stars on a lot of these missions. It is really fucking hard. I will nearly guarantee you are not going to accidentally get a single 5-star on a casual playthrough of Sonic and the Black Knight. It's just not gonna happen. And unlike Sonic and the Secret Rings, which its ranking system was based purely on time, this game is now a score-based game, which I think makes a lot more sense for these storybook games and the way they're designed, because they're really not designed like traditional Sonic games with a focus on time attack. So a score-based system makes more sense here, but I still don't really like it very much, because what you have to do to get a good score in this game is quite tedious for the most part, because you have to kill basically every single enemy in the level. You can leave very, very few stragglers, which means a lot of like backing up to kill the enemy. But at the same time, you also do have to complete the level in a decent amount of time, so you kind of have to get everything as you're moving forward, so if you miss stuff, that's usually going to end up killing your run. You can pretty much not take a single hit at all, and really, in order to optimize your score, you're going to have to use the Soul Surge a lot to get big chains, which is not really my favorite thing, because the Soul Surge is a very slow and boring mechanic to use, and I really just don't like it. And then on top of that, you also have to do a lot of what the game calls acts of chivalry, where you help out NPCs along the way by either giving them some fairies, which you do with a little weird QTE sequence thing here, or there might be ones hidden in cages that you have to free or stuff like that. And you also get points deducted if you like accidentally slash some of them with your sword, and all of this stuff creates for a really annoying scoring system where you have to play through the level so precisely and so perfectly, doing stuff that for the most part isn't really that fun to do. And even that stuff aside, the game is very loose in terms of its gameplay, so even playing it well and precisely can be pretty hard a lot of the time. Like getting through a level without really taking a hit, that is not super easy if you're also trying to rush through the level quickly. There's a lot of stuff where the hitboxes on enemies and stuff are just kind of gonna derp out a little bit, and you're just gonna take hits with not too much you can do about it, and it's pretty annoying. Honestly, I started going for 5 stars on all the missions, but I quickly realized that this was going to be a very long and very tedious and very annoying process that I really couldn't be bothered to do. Some of these missions are so strict, and the scoring system is kind of like vague and hard to understand in such a way that I feel like I would play through the level absolutely perfectly and I would still only get a 4-star rating, and I'm like, what am I doing wrong here? I don't really know. And, like, then that would just turn into, like, looking up strategies of how to get 5 stars on every mission and doing it over and over, not really having a lot of fun. I'm just like, nah, I'm not doing this. Fuck this. But, again, similar to Secret Rings, I did end up going back through the game once I had a pretty leveled up Sonic and just blasted through the levels for fun, and that was really, really enjoyable. Again, this is not really a game that I'm going to try to time attack because it's not really designed for it very much, and the gameplay is still very kind of weird, and it's there's a lot of stuff that I know it's going to get all kinds of derpy, so I just couldn't really be bothered to try. The game's not that fun where I felt motivated to try to do that, so I just kind of left it at that. And overall, I had a good time with Sonic and the Black Knight. I know this game has a pretty bad reputation, but to be honest, I think if you actually try to engage with the game, learn how it works, and figure out its systems, then it's not too bad, and it can generally be pretty fun. The game doesn't do a great job of teaching you the more advanced stuff you can do that makes the game enjoyable, which is, you know, a reoccurring problem that lots of Sonic games have. But overall, I would actually say that I like Sonic and the Black Knight, and that I had a pretty good time playing it. I would actually say that this is a decent Sonic game here, for the most part. Still definitely one of my least favorite games, but one that I can play and have a good time with, so you know? That's not too bad. Good on you, Sonic and the Black Knight. You are pretty alright. And it's kind of a shame that this was the last storybook game, seeing how much they improved from Secret Rings to Black Knight. If we had gotten a third storybook game, then perhaps it could have improved things even more and made a really great game, potentially. I mean, probably not, because, you know, 2000 Sonic Team, problems are the name of the game, but maybe, who knows? I can definitely say that if there was a third storybook Sonic game, I would definitely be interested to give it a shot, but that's probably never gonna happen, so whatever. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time.